$4,000 block of wood. Oh, I watched this guy. This guy makes wood.
Old chunk of walnut and turn it into a shinier old chunk of walnut with some cool tools and just 1 or 2 slip-ups along the way. Stay tuned. This video is actually a couple of years in the making. It started in a small town called Pilot Rock, Oregon, where they had a sawmill and some logs laying around, and I had them mill up some rectangular chunks for me for some projects I was doing back then. This log in particular was split into 2 pieces over at Gobi Walnut. I used their big industrial bandsaw. I thought it would rip right through it. Turns out this walnut pinched the blade really bad, really messed up this bandsaw. I had a heck of a time getting it off there. Eventually, we used their big Makita, it's like an 18-inch blade, to split this thing in half. And I built a mantle for a client a couple of years ago. And this is the 2 pieces that came out. Built a mantle for this one client, and then a couple of years later, he goes, "Hey, do you still have the other half of that piece? I want the same type of mantle for my personal house." It is now the end of November, and
the guy's wearing flip-flops.
Why I'm still wearing flip-flops in the shop, and some of you are probably wondering, why am I wearing flip-flops at all in the shop? And I don't have an answer to the second part of that question, but the first part is these builds take months and months to film, so it was pretty warm when I filmed this. And second, you see there why I wear more protection on my hands than my feet a lot of the times, because I am constantly crushing my hands. And yes, if you're wearing gloves around woodworking machines, you need to be very careful. They're not generally recommended. But I should also mention that I have pretty much transitioned to some pretty heavy-duty boots, which I will get into a little bit later in the video.
My man's just trying to be comfortable.
The client who commissioned this particular piece from me is actually one of my best clients. He has ordered a number of pieces from me over the years because he's kind of a high-end contractor, so I have built pieces for his personal residence as well as pieces for several of his clients. The other half of this log, in fact, became a fireplace mantle for one of his clients who had also commissioned a 10-foot black epoxy and walnut dining table. I was a little uneasy about the idea of doing a wood and epoxy fireplace mantle when he'd first reached out about that original fireplace.
Watch Nyland shorts, they are short and cool
AF. The heat and humidity fluctuations could be a bit much, and potentially wood or epoxy could crack over time. And he told me that the temperature fluctuations weren't going to be as much as I thought. In the end, he accepted the risk of any potential cracks in the wood and or epoxy. Fast forward a couple of years, that mantle is still in perfect shape. He really liked the look. He has similar tables in his house with that black epoxy and walnut, so he commissioned this other half of that walnut log to be used as his fireplace mantle.
Why does he have tape on there?
Anything you've seen so far, all I've done is sealed the entire slab with a clear tabletop epoxy to prevent any color bleeding or staining. Then I sealed everything with a Gorilla Tape to make sure there are no leaks. And I did one thin pour of a more tabletop epoxy in the black to kind of seal up all that tape to, again, guarantee no leaks. The epoxy that I'm going to use to fill all these cracks that serpentine through the center of the table is the liquid glass deep pour epoxy. This is the same epoxy that I use in my traditional epoxy tables, and it's going to work really well at a couple aspects of this. It's very thin, so it's going to hunt and soak through every little nook and cranny and fill all of these cracks that go way, way deep inside this slab. However, the problem is this epoxy doesn't set up for about 24 hours or so, and so if there's any potential for leaking, this thing's going to find its way out. And not that that's any foreshadowing, but there might be a small leak or two after I get this all filled up, because it goes in. I thought I had it sealed pretty well with that tape and that first pour of the faster curing epoxy, but in the end, it just wasn't enough. And I came back like an hour later and it had spilled everywhere. And I'm kind of the guy that realizes a truck is a truck and a shop is a shop, and it's going to get scratches and spills. So I wasn't that worried about this. I didn't love wasting the epoxy. You can see the painter's plastic I put down didn't do a lot. And at this point, this is the one where most people would be like, okay, just let it be. I'll come back and fix it later. Not me. I doubled down. I used this epoxy that had set up for, that was actually probably about 18 hours worth of setting up. And I just dumped it in there. I was like, if I'm going to make a mess, I'm going to make a real mess. And hopefully I can at least get it sealed. This is about 48 hours later, and although it doesn't look great, this is actually a huge win for me. This means I have successfully sealed all the cracks, so I can at least fill them up. And I'm going to do that by scuffing them up with this nylon wheel here to get a good bond. Come back with some tabletop epoxy. No longer going to use that deep pour epoxy. I'm going to do a couple shallow pours of this tabletop epoxy.
So why does he put this stuff in there?
Dye, just like the deep pour epoxy. And it's going to
just makes it last longer, I guess.
Than I'd expected, but in the end, this is easy. I can just do a 1/4-inch pour, come back a couple hours later, do another 1/4-inch pour
to seal the cracks. Okay, but why does he seal the cracks? I understand. So it doesn't have cracks and holes. Okay.
Traditionally, I like to wait till I show a cool tip or a trick, And then on the heels
Do you
of
want
that,
your table
I'll
with
ask, hoping
holes?
that you might feel that I've actually earned your subscription instead of just donating it to me. And this time I'll do it on the heels of this total epoxy blowout and failure,
Not really.
hoping that I just get those sympathy subscriptions. And yes, it does make a big difference to me. No, we don't actually get paid for subscriptions, but now that I'm doing this full time, it is a big deal. And yes, I do have to ask. So if you think that I've earned it, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button.
Yeah.
As some of you may know, I recently hit 1 million subscribers here on YouTube, which is absolutely crazy. And as I got a little bit closer, I decided that I wanted to do a pretty substantial giveaway to thank everybody for being a part of this journey. So I got with some really cool sponsors. We're giving away like $2,000 worth of epoxy, a really cool spiral head wood planer, giant wood slab, finishes.
I could really use some epoxy.
I'm actually donating furniture that I've built. And because my audience is so international, I decided that it would only be fair if anything that we can legally ship worldwide, I'm going to make it eligible to be worldwide. So I'm covering the shipping out of my own pocket. I think it's just a cool thank you to all of you guys. I don't have sponsors for that portion or anything, but I think it's worth it. And I wanted to make this worldwide. I wanted to really thank everybody that's a part of my journey. So if you want more information on that and the products available, click the link in the description below. It's going to run for about 2 weeks. The contest starts today. And just a real thank you to everybody for coming along this journey with me. I had pools of epoxy all over this slab that were going to really make squaring it up difficult because it might rock and tip while it's going through a planer. So before I did anything, I just kind of leveled out all these pools of epoxy. And first off, I should have a mask on. Go ahead and comment because I know you're going to anyway. But yes, I have a mask on here, but I should have had one on the whole time. And now that I got all those high spots kind of planed and sanded down, now I can start the actual process of squaring it up. I'm going to start by making one cut with my track saw. And if you're curious, the blades with fewer teeth are generally the rip blades that go with the grain. The ones with more teeth are generally for either a combination or running across the grain. And that's as detailed as I'm going to get on which blade to choose for your saw, but that's why I'm running this kind of low tooth count blade for ripping this deep cut here. I thought a lot about it, and I probably could have taken this chunk of wood up to Creative Woodworking, the industrial shop that I use up in Southeast Portland. And I bet in about an hour to an hour and a half, I could have done everything that took me probably a day and a half in my shop. And
it is a vacuum. I could tell.
I have a very capable shop, but
it's shaped like one.
Not as good as this particular industrial shop. They have 20-inch jointers and huge planers and a table saw with a 22-inch blade on it. So they could have made all these cuts, all these passes in absolutely no time. Probably been more accurate with a nicer finish. But since I was doing this for a video, I decided to use the shop that I do have. And like I said, it's a totally capable shop. Just gets a little awkward with me crab walking around with this giant chunk of walnut. What I'm using here is my first ever DIY jointer sled, and a jointer sled essentially turns a
So is he making a bench? I'm just trying to think of when a big slab of wood like this would ever be used.
You can't just plane a bowed piece of wood and have it come out flat, because if you send a curved piece of wood through a planer, you get a thinner curved
a fireplace mantle. That makes sense. That makes sense.
Come up with some kind of jointer sled so it doesn't rock and twist as it
Wait, we have one of those.
And it actually worked pretty well. It wasn't great. I can do some things to improve on it. But now that I have one perfectly flat side, now I can use the planer and bring that other side down so it runs perfectly flat and parallel to the bottom. Now, some of you might already be furiously commenting that first cut I made on the track saw
this guy hates commenters.
Couldn't actually be perpendicular to the top or the bottom because I made it before the top and the bottom was perfectly flat. So yes, I do have to come back and make another pass with the track saw. However, the track saw wasn't deep enough to cut the entire...
Can you imagine? I just want to know, like, seeing the video and you're so... God damn it. Fuck. I don't know if you guys saw the moment where the mantle wasn't lined up properly. Can you imagine?
Higher thickness of this. So here's what I came up with to make sure I had a perfectly consistent surface the whole way across. And this is using my flush trim bit, which is a really slick little bit. And I'm showing you without the dust collection here first, just so you can see how good the dust collection does work on this router.
Backseat
woodwork. My favorite tool, but this dust collection on this is actually pretty slick. So I hooked it on there, just a regular old Festool vacuum hooked up to it. It doesn't get 100% of the chips, but it makes a massive, massive difference. So if you like a dust-free shop, I do recommend this router. Now that the top, bottom, and one side are all perfectly flat and perpendicular to each other, we can cut it to its final dimensions using the table saw. And we talked a little bit about blade choice with that track saw earlier, but I wanted to elaborate on it for the table saw here because I remember being really intimidated when I used to go to like Home Depot and I said, I need a table saw blade, and nothing's labeled table saw. They only give the tooth count. And so I'm like, why don't they just tell you what's for a chop saw and what's for a table saw? It's really intimidating. So I'll do a quick down and dirty, like 30-second lesson on it. And I'm using a rip blade, which is for cutting with the grain. And this is a 24 tooth blade, which is a great tooth count for a rip blade. If you want to do with the grain and across the grain, a 40 tooth with a 10-inch saw blade is a great choice. And if you want a purely crosscut only, a 60 tooth is a good blade for that. I do have the full kerf blades, which are the 1/8-inch blades. They're quite a bit better than those thin ones you get. If you're just wanting to kind of rough cut things, those thin kerf blades are fine. But for me, I like the 24, the 40, and the 60 tooth, depending on which cuts I'm making. To get its final size, the last thing I had to do was make a couple cross cuts, and for this, I put the 40 tooth blade back on as a CMT blade, really pretty good affordable blade, and then did the same trick with my router and the flush trim bit. After it got cut to its final size, I had about another 6 days of touch-ups because I needed to touch each side up and I needed gravity as an assistant.
How much does a fucking mantle like this cost, man?
Touch up another side, including both ends. So I spent a ton of time doing all those little touch-ups. After the days and days of touch-ups and waiting for it to cure, I was ready to flatten it out with my belt
It's
sander.
taking him literally days.
Pretty bad, so here's a little trick.
So it's got to be thousands.
Tools that they normally use for drum sanders to clean that epoxy off your belts, and it doesn't just work for belt sanders, it works for
4K to 10K?
Well.
Jesus.
All right, now we are actually ready to mount this thing to the floating shelf bracket that I have, and this is a pretty standard one. I ordered it on Etsy. It uses 1-inch tubes. I'm going to be drilling my holes with a 1 1/16 inch bit, and I'll explain why in just a minute, but normally, I feel like I am the guy that has access to a ton of tools, whether they're at my shop or that industrial shop in Portland. And this is one time that I felt like I was really dangerously under-tooled for this project. So I'll probably get some comments from you guys about why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do that? Or why don't you just buy this tool?
He's so mad.
And like a lot of you out there, I just had to use the tools that I had. And they're pretty good. I mean, not everybody has a drill press, and it was hard to get lined up exactly perfectly perpendicular to this slab. But in the end, I was able to use what I had, and I feel like that's what most of us do with our projects. Is I love having a tool for every job, but this is one time that I probably didn't quite have the right tools for this job. The reason I'm using a slightly larger drill bit than my rod size is that I know no matter how perfect I try to make this, this hole isn't going to be absolutely perpendicular, and my marks might be off just by a hair. And so if I had tried to drill an absolutely perfect 1-inch hole for this 1-inch rod to fit in, almost certainly wouldn't fit, and if it did fit, it would probably get stuck and not come out. So giving myself about a 1/16 of an inch bit of wiggle room on each of my holes is going to make it still snug enough that it'll be held on by friction, but enough wiggle room that it can come on and off.
Wow.
Another issue I ran into is that I only have about a 3.5 inch or so depth on my drill press, so I had to drill the rest by hand, and I could have kept raising the table with that auger bit inside the hole, which probably would have been easier because this about broke my wrist 40 times. So I didn't love this method. If I was doing it again, I might consider actually doing that all on the drill press. But you see just how deep I have to go. So I would have had to keep raising that drill press table a little bit at a time as I drilled that hole. And in the end, we got the job done. Also, you might be wondering why I'm not using like a spade bit with an impact driver. Those holes don't get drilled perfectly straight. That spade bit can actually hunt kind of left and right. These auger bits are pretty much guaranteed to go in perfectly straight. The way this fireplace is going to go together is they're going to first install the mantle, and then they're going to surround the entire mantle and, of course, the whole fireplace with the stone facade. So you won't really actually see that mounting plate on the back, which may lead you to wonder, why am I going to the trouble of recessing this mounting plate when you're not going to see it anyway, because it's going to have, 2 inches of stone in front of it. You would never see the 1/4 inch mounting plate. And the quick answer is, it's a really good client and he likes nice stuff, so I'm just going to do it the cleanest possible way. And I didn't even bother with asking him whether or not he cared if I recessed this. I just thought it would look a little bit better and be a little bit cleaner. And you know what? This is a $4,000 chunk of wood, so why not make it as good as I can? But yeah, in the end, probably not going to see it. Not a big deal, but just trying to take care of my client. One of the last things I need to do structurally before I get to finishing is add some Dutchman joints to the cracks on the ends of this mantle. And these are always hilariously controversial because I get tons of comments from people that tell me, if their table showed up with a bow tie in it, they wouldn't pay for it, and I ruined that table by adding bow tie joints. And first off, I always ask my clients, they 100% of the time always ask for them before I put them in. And while I love the feedback, I need that feedback in my life, I'm not positive these clients and designers of $1 million homes are combing the YouTube comments looking for inspiration. You might have noticed me looking a little bit more professional, not just in the shop, but on the walks with the dog, climbing ladders, cleaning the roof off, all thanks to my new gear from area at work. I wear it every day, whether or not I'm in the shop or on camera. And here is a bonus trick for you. Clean your boots with air, not water. This is something a farmer showed me a couple years ago, so I keep a small compressor just at the edge of our garage. Works amazing. Anyway, they are having their biggest sale of the year for Black Friday, so if you want some details on that, click the link in the description below. When I traced this first bow tie, I made the biggest mistake you can make when doing this, and that is removing it without one side being marked on there, because it is going to be so hard to line it up again and get that line to line up perfectly with the other one. So we'll see how that one turns out, but that is about the biggest mistake you can make. Make sure you get all the sides before you remove it from that double-sided tape. If you've never tried an inlay and you've wanted to, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. All you really need to do is need to hog out that center area. I like a router with a spiral bit, just a straight 1/4-inch bit. I've seen people do the entire process with chisels or hogging that center area out with just a drill.
That's like a Dead Space weapon.
After that, you just need some really sharp chisels, and these are some really sharp chisels. These are Japanese chisels. These are kind of like a fancy Damascus one. You don't need any this fancy. I just like really cool chisels. I'm a sucker for the Japanese ones. They get crazy sharp. But the Japanese ones are really brittle, which is why you see me using this American chisel here to kind of hog out the material on the corner. And I feel like this could fit into a number of stereotypes for the Japanese versus American woodworkers. The Japanese chisels are all about sharp and precision, and the American ones are all about just hogging out and kind of sloppy work. So that's why you don't want to use the Japanese ones for that corner, because they are brittle and you can break them. The American ones are a little bit more robust, but not quite as sharp. Also, I damaged that spot right there, so we'll see if we can fix it when we do the inlay, but I did let that chisel get away from me just a little bit. After you get your negative cut, you're ready to drop in your inlay, and for this, I recommend using wood glue. I've used epoxy in the past, but just like once or twice.
So wait, he cut out the wood and then put different wood back in?
A wet line, so no matter how tight your inlay is,
why would you do this?
Epoxy will always look like it has a wet line around the perimeter. And then to fill any micro imperfections, I use a combination of walnut and elm dust. And this just kind of breaks up that solid color of using just walnut or just elm.
Is it a detail like art thing, like signing a photo?
I generally let these set overnight before coming and smoothing them out. And I've used a number of methods to smooth these out in the past.
Some people are saying it makes it like stronger.
Now I kind of like this block plane. I've been using it for
cracking
a while,
and splitting.
And it seems to be about the best method. You just bring it down about as close as you can get it to the wood, and then I'll finish it off with something like my Rotex sander or just a regular orbital sander. The sanding process that included countless touch-ups is kind of like the 6 days of epoxy touch-ups, meaning I won't force you guys to watch every single step that went into all the sanding, filling a tiny imperfection, sanding it some more, filling another imperfection.
Does he have to do the other side?
So I'll kind of give you the down and dirty version, meaning I like this pencil grid because it helps me track where I've sanded it and where I haven't sanded. But I sanded it from 100 up to 180, and this is a new sandpaper to me. This is a crazy sandpaper. It is awesome. It was recommended on another YouTube video I saw. I believe it was Katz Moses. Gave it a shot, and this isn't sponsored. It's made by 3M, but 3M's too big to even care about me, so they wouldn't sponsor me. But it's a really, really remarkable sandpaper. It doesn't clog. It gives the best pattern I've ever seen. I've never actually felt this passionate about a sandpaper before. And again, I got to stress, it's not sponsored or anything like that. I will include a link in the description. But no, this is like the first big change in sandpaper that I've ever experienced. Highly recommend it.
Wait,
The finish I'm using here is called Rubio Monaco, and they make a ton of different colors. So I will link the specific one I'm using here in the video description, along with links to everything else you've seen in the video, also in the video description. And you should know those are affiliate links, which just means I get a tiny percentage of anything that sells. And it's not a ton of money, but at the end of the year, it can actually make a big difference. So if you're thinking about buying something, I do appreciate it if you click through those links.
I had to pick my nose.
This finish is remarkably easy to apply. You basically just wipe it on until it's completely saturated. Make sure you wipe off all excess, which is why I have this handy little light here, which is a pretty cool little photography light stick. Make sure I got it all buffed off. The next day I come back and I sand the entire thing with this maroon pad. And I got a little spoiler here. I do 2 coats. I get it just almost absolutely perfect. And then I find a flaw, which I'll show you here in just a second. But I got everything sanded with that maroon pad. Came back, did my second coat, and this is where it really starts to come alive. This is where it just looks beautiful. And I was pretty happy up to this point. And then I looked down, and there was these tiny little holes, and they were right on the front. And they're not huge, but I think the theme of this is trying to justify the value to the client. And that's why I charge the prices I charge, because I go through and I make sure everything's right. So had to fill this with this black CA glue. And unfortunately, you can't just like Bondo this on there and smooth it out. I had to go back after touching these up and sand the entire piece and do 2 more coats. So basically,
Jake and Bake is now a carpenter.
So
also, will you ever finish raw
I think actually 240 grits, just so I didn't have to run through all my grits. Got those bits sanded out, went through the entire process again, and then I was ready for another 2 coats of the Rubio. At this point, I was a little frustrated, but I wasn't nearly as frustrated as I would be as if I made a mistake a second time. So I made extra special care to look closely, make sure there was no more imperfections.
Jake and Bake is now a carpenter?
Quite cured, so it kind of gummed up that sandpaper. So you can use that same eraser trick on
Wait, it actually sounds just like him.
Off if it gets kind of gummy or stuck in there. From there, you just add more Rubio. You've seen this process before. You basically just wipe it on, wipe it off. So I will spare you having to watch both coats go on, but I did add another 2 coats.
Oh my God.
With that maroon pad in between. This mantle is actually on a truck headed to upstate New York as we speak right now. And upstate New York is one place that I've never been, and it is somewhere that I genuinely would like to go. And every week I like to give a little bit of credit to people that make it all the way to the...
All right, that's pretty cool.